In 2023, American pharmacies dispensed 41 million Adderall prescriptions. That number needs a moment to land. 41 million. Enough pills to give every single adult living in California a full month's supply, and still have bottles left sitting on the shelf. Not illicit pills, not counterfeit. Legitimate physician-signed insurance-covered prescriptions for a substance that, molecule for molecule, belongs to the same chemical family as the white powder being sold in nightclub bathrooms on a Saturday night. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. The United States did not arrive at 41 million quietly. In 1990, the total number of stimulant prescriptions written for ADHD in America was just under 900,000. That means in 33 years, prescribing volume increased by more than 4,400%. No other class of controlled substance in American medical history has followed that trajectory. Not opioids, not benzodiazepines. Nothing comes close to that curve on a graph, a line that starts flat, barely visible, and then bends upwards so sharply it looks like an error. It was not an error. Globally, the picture is even harder to contain in a single thought. Amphetamine-type stimulants are now the second most widely used illicit drug on Earth, behind only cannabis. An estimated 34 million people use them recreationally, every year, not lifetime, every year, across every continent, every income bracket, every age group. The same molecule showing up in a child's school lunch bag and in a Southeast Asian factory, where workers are handed pills to keep production lines moving through the night. Then came August 2021. Pharmacies across the United States began running out of Adderall, not in one city, not because of a flood or a factory fire or a shipping delay. The shortage spread from state to state over a period of weeks, quietly at first, a pharmacist in Ohio telling a patient to try again Thursday, a mother in Georgia calling 6 different pharmacies and getting the same answer from all 6. By October, the FDA had done something it almost never does. It formally declared a nationwide drug shortage for a Schedule II controlled substance that was being manufactured in perfectly functional facilities by perfectly operational companies. The factories were running. The shortage was real anyway. Over 3 million patients who depended on the medication, children, adults, people who had been taking it for years without interruption, suddenly found themselves without it. Some experienced what their doctors carefully described as discontinuation effects, crushing fatigue, an inability to complete tasks they had managed for years, the sensation, reported by many, that their brain had simply gone quiet in a way that felt less like rest and more like damage. The reason for the shortage was not a broken machine. The reason was that America had been consuming stimulants at a rate so high, so sustained, and so continuously accelerating that even legally authorized production quotas, set each year by the Drug Enforcement Administration, the federal agency that controls how much of a Schedule II substance can be manufactured, could no longer keep up with the volume of legitimate prescriptions being written by legitimate doctors for legitimate patients. Supply had failed to keep up with demand. The demand was the crisis. A man named Daniel Reyes, 34 years old, a software engineer living in Austin, Texas, felt the shortage arrive on a Tuesday morning when his usual pharmacy's automated system sent him a text. Out of stock. No estimated restock date. He had been taking Adderall since he was 9 years old. 25 years of daily use, uninterrupted, a prescription that had simply always been there the way electricity is always there, until suddenly it wasn't. He spent that morning staring at the text on his phone for longer than he would later be able to explain. He did not know, sitting there, that the pill in his orange bottle and the substance fueling a catastrophic drug crisis across rural America were separated by a single methyl group. One carbon atom, two hydrogen atoms, attached differently on the same base molecule. That is the entire chemical distance between Adderall and methamphetamine. One modification, executed in any moderately equipped laboratory, and one becomes the other. The body processes both through the same receptors. The brain responds to both by releasing the same chemicals. The difference in effect is one of degree, not of kind. The legal one came in a child-proof bottle with his name on it. The illegal one had destroyed entire counties. How does that happen? How does a molecule, synthesized by a Romanian chemist in a Bucharest laboratory in 1887 for reasons that had nothing to do with the human brain, travel through 138 years of history to arrive simultaneously in a pediatrician's prescription pad and in a DEE evidence locker? How does something that began as a solution end up as a problem so vast it caused a national shortage just by being used correctly? The answer is not simple. It never is when the answer involves money, medicine, war, and the particular human tendency to keep doing something long after the evidence says to stop. It starts in a laboratory. It starts with a discovery that looked, at the time, like nothing at all. Bucharest, 1887. The city was still burning gas lamps on most of its streets. The university chemistry department occupied a building where the plaster cracked in winter, and the equipment arrived months late from Germany. A young Romanian chemist named Lazar Edeleanu was working through a systematic investigation of phenyl-substituted compounds, the kind of painstaking, unglamorous laboratory work that fills notebooks and produces almost nothing of immediate value. He was 24 years old, methodical, trained in Berlin, and entirely unaware that what he was about to synthesize would one day be consumed by hundreds of millions of people. He called it phenylisopropylamine. The synthesis itself was not complicated by the standards of organic chemistry. Edeleanu combined the right precursors, applied the right conditions, and produced a new compound. He recorded it in his notes. He published a brief paper in a German chemistry journal, a dry technical document describing the compound structure, not its effects, because effects were not what he was studying. Then he moved on to other work. The paper circulated among a narrow community of chemists, generated no particular excitement, and was filed into the growing archive of known but unexplored compounds. For 40 years, phenylisopropylamine sat there, in the literature, documented, accessible, completely ignored. The world in 1887 had no framework for understanding what the compound could do to a human nervous system, because the concept of neurotransmitters, the chemical messengers the brain uses to regulate mood, focus, and energy, would not be scientifically established for another 4 decades. Edeleanu had no way of knowing he had synthesized a molecule that fits into the brain's reward and attention system the way a key fits a lock. He had made the key. The lock hadn't been discovered yet. The 40 years of silence ended in Los Angeles. Gordon Alice was 30 years old in 1927, working as a research chemist under contract with pharmaceutical interests in California. The problem he was trying to solve was practical and urgent. Ephedrine, a compound derived from the Chinese plant mahuang, was the most effective treatment available for asthma. It opened the airways, reduced bronchial spasm, and genuinely helped people breathe. But natural ephedrine was expensive to produce and dependent on an unstable supply of Chinese plant material. The pharmaceutical industry wanted a synthetic alternative, something that could be manufactured in a laboratory, in volume, reliably, without relying on harvests and shipping routes from the other side of the world. Alice worked through a series of synthetic compounds, testing each one. He was not looking for a drug that affected mood or cognition. He was looking for something that opened airways. When he reached phenylysopropylamine, Idelianu's 40-year-old compound still sitting in the literature, he tested it on himself. What happened next was not what he expected. Alice injected a measured dose directly and sat with his notes. What he recorded in the hours that followed was not bronchial dilation. The compound was, in fact, a mediocre asthma treatment compared to ephedrine. What he recorded instead was a profound and unsettling clarity. His mind felt organized in a way it normally did not. Tasks that usually required effort felt effortless. There was a sensation he described as a kind of interior brightness, a sense that the world had sharpened without changing. His mood was elevated, but not chaotically. More like a dial had been turned up to a setting he hadn't known existed. He also noted that he couldn't sleep that night. Alice filed a patent, not for an asthma drug, for the compound itself, recognizing that whatever it was doing to the human brain, it was doing something remarkable enough to be worth owning. He then licensed the patent to Smith, Kline and French, a Philadelphia pharmaceutical company, in 1932. The company's researchers immediately understood what they had. This was not primarily a respiratory drug. This was a mood-altering, energy-elevating, focus-sharpening compound that could be manufactured cheaply, at scale, and sold legally over a pharmacy counter. They named it Benzedrine. The era in which this happened matters enormously. America in 1932 was in the depths of the Great Depression, unemployment at 25%, a population exhausted, demoralized, and desperate for something that might restore a sense of forward motion. The country had also just spent a decade watching prohibition fail in spectacular fashion, which had produced a specific cultural lesson. Banning substances does not eliminate the desire for them. It just moves the market. American pharmaceutical culture in the early 1930s operated in a regulatory environment so minimal it barely constituted oversight. If a company could demonstrate a medical use, any medical use, a compound could go to market. Benzedrine's official medical use was nasal congestion. That was enough. The first Benzedrine inhaler went on sale in 1933. It looked like a small aluminum tube, not unlike a modern asthma inhaler, roughly the size of a thumb. Inside, a paper strip saturated with 250 milligrams of amphetamine base, a quantity that, if consumed rather than inhaled, was enough to produce a pronounced stimulant effect. The label said, "For nasal congestion." The price was $1, no prescription required. Smith, Kline and French knew, from Alice's notes and from their own internal testing, that the compound produced effects well beyond nasal decongestion. Those effects were not mentioned on the packaging. The company's internal correspondence from this period, some of which would only become available to researchers decades later, shows executives discussing the compound's mood-elevating properties as a marketing advantage, not a liability. The inhaler sold well from the first week. What happened next was not a mystery and not an accident. It was, in a very specific way, a preview of every decision that would be made about this molecule for the next 90 years. The compound worked. It worked visibly, quickly, reliably. It made people feel better in ways they could not easily articulate but absolutely did not want to stop. And the people who manufactured it knew this and said nothing to the people who were buying it. In laboratories across the country, pharmacologists who had obtained samples of Benzedrine began running tests. The results were consistent. This compound crossed the blood-brain barrier rapidly, flooded the synaptic gaps between neurons with dopamine and norepinephrine, and produced a stimulant effect more powerful and more sustained than anything previously available without a prescription. A few of those researchers wrote cautionary notes in their published findings. The notes were modest in tone, buried in methodology sections, and attracted almost no attention. No one issued a warning. No regulator asked Smith, Kline and French to expand the product labeling. The inhaler remained on the shelf, $1, no prescription, available in any pharmacy in America. In the universities, students had already discovered what happened when the paper strip inside the inhaler was removed, unrolled, dissolved in a cup of coffee, and swallowed. The effect was considerably stronger than the inhaling. The effect lasted considerably longer. The effect allowed a person to study through the night, sit an exam at 8 in the morning, and still feel functional at noon. This was 1934. The drug had been on the market for less than a year. Nobody at Smith, Kline and French was watching the university campuses, or if they were, nobody wrote it down in a way that has survived. The compound was selling. The patents were held. The revenue was growing. The question of what was happening to the people who were dissolving the paper strips in their coffee was, for the moment, not the question anyone in a position of authority was asking. That question was coming. But first, a war. By 1937, amphetamine had acquired its first official medical legitimacy beyond the inhaler. The American Medical Association approved Benzedrine tablets for narcolepsy, depression, and obesity, 3 entirely different conditions treated by the same molecule, prescribed by doctors who had received almost no formal training in its mechanism or its risks. The prescription version sat behind the pharmacy counter. The inhaler version sat in front of it. A person could walk in, buy both, and leave in under 5 minutes. The students had known about the inhaler trick for 3 years by then. Word spread the way useful information always spreads among people under pressure, directly, personally, with specific instructions. Which pharmacy, how many strips, how much water, how long to wait. By the late 1930s, Benzedrine use on American university campuses was common enough to have a specific social context around it. Exam season. The drug had carved out a niche so quickly and so cleanly that it barely registered as drug use. It registered as studying. Then the war arrived, and everything changed scale. The military application of amphetamine was not an accident of circumstance. It was a deliberate decision made simultaneously by multiple governments, who each arrived at the same conclusion independently. Soldiers get tired. Tired soldiers make fatal errors, retreat when they shouldn't, fall asleep at positions that need to be held. A pill that could eliminate fatigue for 12 to 14 hours, sharpen reaction time, and elevate aggression was not a luxury for a military planner in 1939. It was a tactical asset. Germany moved first, and Germany moved fastest. The German military's version was not Benzedrine. It was Pervitin, a methamphetamine tablet, chemically 1 step further along the stimulant spectrum than standard amphetamine, more potent, faster acting, and considerably more destabilizing over time. Pervitin was developed by the Temmler Pharmaceutical Company in Berlin in 1937 and was initially sold over the counter to the German civilian population. It was marketed in chocolate form. German housewives consumed it for energy and weight management. Pilots used it recreationally. It was briefly a fashionable drug in the way that certain substances become fashionable, visible in social settings, discussed approvingly in newspapers, associated with modernity and performance. The Wehrmacht's command saw something else in it entirely. In the spring of 1940, as Germany prepared the offensive through the Ardennes that would collapse France in 6 weeks, the military distributed approximately 35 million Pervitin tablets to soldiers and pilots. 35 million tablets in a single campaign. Panzer crews drove through the night without stopping. Infantry units covered distances in darkness that military planners had calculated as requiring daylight and rest. The blitzkrieg speed, the quality that made it so devastatingly effective, the quality that generals on the Allied side genuinely could not comprehend in real time, was chemically assisted. France fell in 46 days. German military doctors were present throughout the campaign, and some of them were paying close attention to what they saw. The tablets produced the desired effect in the short term. They also produced something else. Soldiers who had been awake for 48 or 60 hours on Pervitin began exhibiting behaviours that did not appear in any standard combat stress documentation. Erratic decision-making. Sudden violent outbursts disconnected from tactical necessity. Hallucinations reported by men who had not been wounded. And when the tablets were withdrawn, because supply lines stretched, because a unit moved faster than its logistics, the crash was not simply tiredness, it was a collapse. Men who had been performing at an artificially elevated level for days dropped so completely that officers filed formal reports questioning whether they had been poisoned. 3 military physicians attached to frontline units compiled those reports into a formal memorandum addressed to Wehrmacht High Command in late 1940. The memorandum was specific. The drug was creating dependency, and the dependency was creating a different kind of soldier than the one military planners thought they were building. The memorandum was received, logged, and filed without response. The distribution of Pervitin continued. Those 3 reports would not surface in accessible historical archives until the 1980s. On the other side of the conflict, Britain and the United States were running their own amphetamine programs. RAF Bomber Command issued Benzedrine to pilots before long-range missions over Germany. 8-hour flights at altitude, in cold, in darkness, requiring sustained alertness that no amount of caffeine could reliably provide. The American military issued Benzedrine tablets to soldiers in the Pacific Theater, beginning in 1942, framing it in orientation materials as a tool for emergency use, to be taken when combat conditions made sleep impossible. The emergency use framing lasted approximately 1 deployment cycle. By 1943, military medical officers in multiple theatres were documenting casual habitual use among enlisted men and officers alike. The pill was not being saved for emergencies. It was being taken before patrols, before guard shifts, before anything that felt like it required performance. Men were sharing supplies, trading tablets like cigarettes, taking doses without consulting medical staff. The military knew this was happening. The response was not to restrict distribution. It was to increase production quotas and ensure supply chains remained intact. Japan distributed its own methamphetamine, called Philipon, to kamikaze pilots and factory workers simultaneously. The logic was identical in both contexts. Maximum output, minimum rest. Consequences deferred to a future that, for kamikaze pilots, was not expected to arrive. The war ended in 1945. Approximately 72 million military personnel across all nations had served during the conflict. A significant but uncounted fraction of them had been issued amphetamine-type stimulants during their service. No demobilization protocol addressed this. No military medical program screened returning soldiers for stimulant dependence. The pills simply stopped being issued. The soldiers came home, and then something happened that nobody in any government had planned for. The surplus did not disappear. Japanese Philipon stockpiles, no longer needed for the war effort, leaked into the civilian market in 1945 and 1946. Within 2 years, Japan had an amphetamine epidemic affecting an estimated 550,000 people, one of the first large-scale civilian stimulant crises in recorded history, happening in a country already devastated by defeat, occupation, and economic collapse. People injecting methamphetamine in the ruins of cities that had been firebombed because the drug made the ruins feel survivable. The United States did not have a street crisis in 1945. It had something different and in some ways more durable. It had a pharmaceutical infrastructure that had spent 6 years treating amphetamine as a legitimate medical tool, a prescribing culture that had normalized the substance across multiple conditions, and a returning veteran population that knew, from direct personal experience, what the drug felt like. Smith, Kline, and French had not slowed production during the war. They had accelerated it. The factories were running at full capacity, the distribution networks were national, and the marketing apparatus was already pivoting from wartime utility to peacetime application. The question the company's executives were asking in 1945 was not whether to continue selling amphetamine. That was settled. The question was who, in peacetime America, needed it most. The answer they arrived at would shape the next 30 years of American medicine, and it would reach, in ways nobody in 1945 could have traced, all the way to a 9-year-old boy in Austin, Texas, sitting in a pediatrician's office in 1999, while a doctor explained to his mother that the pill being prescribed was safe, well understood, and had been used for decades. That boy's name was Daniel Reyes, and the doctor was not wrong. Not exactly. The pill had been used for decades. That part was true. What the doctor did not say, because the doctor did not know, was what those decades had actually looked like. Post-war America had a particular texture to it that is easy to misread from the outside. The surface was prosperity, new suburbs, new cars, new appliances, a country that had won a war and was now building a future at remarkable speed. But underneath that surface ran a current of exhaustion that the victory parades had not touched. Men had come home from places that couldn't be described to people who hadn't been there. Women who had run households, worked factory shifts, and managed every practical dimension of family life alone for 3 or 4 years were now expected to step back into domestic arrangements that had existed before the war, as if the intervening years had not happened. The decade between 1945 and 1955 was, in its quiet interior, a decade of people trying very hard to feel normal and not entirely succeeding. The pharmaceutical industry had a solution. Smith, Kline, and French had spent the war years not only manufacturing Benzedrine but studying it, specifically studying the range of conditions it could plausibly treat, because a compound with a single approved indication is a limited commercial asset, while a compound approved for 6 conditions is an entirely different financial instrument. By 1946, amphetamine had been formally studied as a treatment for depression, obesity, narcolepsy, fatigue, low blood pressure, seasickness, and a cluster of complaints then grouped under the clinical umbrella of neurotic conditions, a category broad enough to contain almost any form of human unhappiness. By 1955, there were approximately 8 million amphetamine prescriptions being dispensed annually in the United States. 8 million in a country of 165 million people. The math means that roughly 1 in every 20 Americans had an active amphetamine prescription, not counting the inhalers, which remained available without a prescription until 1959. The drug that was doing all of this work had a specific mechanism, and understanding that mechanism explains why so many doctors, for so long, believed they were doing the right thing. Amphetamine enters the bloodstream rapidly and crosses the blood-brain barrier within minutes. Once inside the brain, it does not create new chemicals. It forces the release of chemicals that are already there. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter most associated with reward and motivation, norepinephrine, which governs alertness, focus, and the body's readiness to act. serotonin, to a lesser degree affecting mood and emotional regulation. The drug essentially reaches into the brain storage systems and forces those chemicals out into the synaptic gaps between neurons, producing a flood of signal that the brain interprets as clarity, energy, purpose, and well-being. The effect feels, to the person experiencing it, like finally being awake. Not the artificial alertness of caffeine, which works by blocking the receptors that register fatigue rather than by actively releasing stimulating chemicals. This was something different, an interior brightness, a sense that the mind was operating at a level it was always supposed to reach, but usually didn't. People described being able to think through problems that had felt foggy for months. Tasks they had been avoiding for weeks were completed in an afternoon. The emotional weight that had been sitting on a person's chest since before they could name it, lighter, not gone, but lighter. For a nation carrying the unprocessed weight of a global war, this was not a trivial effect. Dr. Harold Perkins ran a family medicine practice on a tree-lined street in Cincinnati, Ohio, in 1956. He had served as a military physician in the Pacific from 1943 to 1945, had seen Benzedrine issued to soldiers, and had returned to civilian practice with a working familiarity with the drug that most civilian physicians lacked. His patient panel was largely working class and lower middle class, factory workers, their wives, their aging parents. He had 340 patients. By 1956, he had written amphetamine prescriptions for 67 of them. He kept careful notes. The notes from this period show a pattern that was entirely consistent with what the medical literature was reporting. Patients felt better. Depression lifted. Weight dropped. Women who had described an inability to get out of bed in the morning reported getting up an hour earlier and feeling, as one patient's note recorded, more like herself. Perkins renewed prescriptions without hesitation. The patients who were doing well stayed on the drug. The patients who weren't doing well got a higher dose. In 1956, this was not malpractice. It was standard of care. What Perkins did not have visibility into, what no individual prescribing physician in 1956 could easily see, was the aggregate pattern. The single physician sees one patient at a time, improvement or stagnation, dose adjusted, next appointment scheduled. The pattern that only becomes visible when you pull back far enough to see thousands of patients simultaneously is a different picture entirely. Tolerance building, doses quietly escalating over months. Patients who had originally been prescribed the drug for depression, now unable to feel anything approaching normal without it. Bodies that had recalibrated around the artificial chemical flood to such a degree that the brain's own production of dopamine and norepinephrine had quietly, measurably diminished. 3 of Perkins's patients were already doubling their doses without telling him. He would not find out for 2 years, and only because one of them stopped eating. In the examination rooms of thousands of practices like Perkins's, a specific demographic was being reached most aggressively by the pharmaceutical marketing apparatus: women. Smith, Klein and French, and competitors who had entered the market by the early 1950s, directed their sales literature specifically at the conditions most commonly diagnosed in women: depression, anxiety, weight gain, fatigue, the vague cluster of complaints that physicians of the era often labelled nervous exhaustion. The marketing did not use the word amphetamine prominently. It used the brand names Dexedrine, Benzedrine, Desoxin, alongside images of women who looked composed, energetic, and thin. Dexedrine's promotional materials sent to physicians in 1956 described the drug as helping women feel better, work better, and manage the demands of home life more effectively. The phrase home life was doing significant work in that sentence. The drug was being positioned not as a treatment for a specific medical condition, but as a performance enhancer for the particular performance that mid-century American culture demanded of women. It was selling at volumes the company had not projected. Far from Cincinnati, in a different part of the same story, Carmen Reyes sat in a pediatrician's office in Austin, Texas, in the spring of 1999. Her son Daniel was 9 years old and had spent the third grade accumulating a paper trail that the school counselor had organized into a manila folder. Teacher notes describing a child who could not sit still, could not follow multi-step instructions, lost materials constantly, called out answers before questions were finished, and tested in the 92nd percentile for intelligence, while simultaneously failing to complete routine assignments. The counselor had referred the family to the pediatrician. The pediatrician had administered a behavioral assessment. The assessment results fit the diagnostic criteria for attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, with a clarity that left little room for interpretation. The pediatrician explained the diagnosis to Carmen with patience and without alarm. A DHD, he told her, was not a character flaw in her son. It was a neurological condition, a difference in how the brain managed attention and impulse control, rooted in the same dopamine and norepinephrine systems that were now well understood in the medical literature. The treatment that had the strongest evidence base, he said, was stimulant medication. Specifically, a relatively new formulation called Adderall, which combined two forms of amphetamine salt in a ratio designed to produce a smoother, more sustained effect than older stimulant medications. He said the medication was safe. He said it had been studied. He said the risks were well documented and manageable. Carmen asked how long Daniel would need to take it. The pediatrician said they would reassess every year. Daniel started taking the pill on a Monday morning. By Thursday of the same week, his teacher sent home a note. Not a complaint, a different kind of note entirely. She wrote that Daniel had completed every assignment that day, had waited to be called on 3 times in a row, and had helped another student find a lost pencil without being asked. Carmen read the note twice, standing at the kitchen counter, and felt something she would later describe only as relief so large it was almost physical. The pill was working. The pill was genuinely, visibly, measurably working. What neither Carmen nor the pediatrician nor Daniel's teacher could see on that Thursday afternoon was the longer arc. The arc that ran back through 4 decades of prescribing, through Perkins's patient files in Cincinnati, through the women on Dexedrine who had started at 1 tablet and ended at 3, through the soldiers who had come home from 2 continents carrying a familiarity with the drug that nobody had screened for. The arc that ran forward too, though nobody in that office in 1999 was looking forward. Daniel swallowed the pill every morning with a glass of orange juice. He grew, he did his homework, his grades stabilized, then improved. The prescription was renewed every year, as promised. The dose increased twice as he got older, and his body weight increased. Nobody flagged this as unusual. It was by every clinical measure available a straightforward, successful treatment course. In the filing cabinet at the FDA's offices in Rockville, Maryland, there was a document that had been sitting there since 1959, a classified internal report. 4 researchers, 40 pages. Its central finding: amphetamine produced measurable physical and psychological dependence in a significant percentage of patients, and the current prescribing guidelines contain no mechanism for identifying or addressing this dependence before it became severe. The document had been classified for 6 years before anyone outside the FDA would see it. The year was now 1956, and Dr. Harold Perkins was writing his 68th amphetamine prescription. He had no idea the report existed. The document that changed nothing was written in 1959 by 4 researchers inside the FDA's own division of pharmacology. Their names were not classified. Their methodology was not classified. Only their conclusion was, the part that stated, in the careful, hedged language of government science, that amphetamine produced a pattern of physiological and psychological adaptation consistent with dependency in a statistically significant portion of long-term users, and that current prescribing guidelines contain no mechanism for detecting this adaptation before it became clinically severe. 40 pages, signed by 4 people, stamped, filed, and not released to the public for 6 years. 6 years is a long time in a pharmacy. The decision to classify the report was not made by the researchers. It was made at an administrative level above them by people whose names do not appear in the document and whose reasoning was never formally recorded. What is recorded is the outcome. Between 1959 and 1965, while the report sat in a filing cabinet, amphetamine prescriptions in the United States continued climbing. New formulations entered the market. New indications were approved. The prescribing culture that Dr. Perkins represented in Cincinnati was not an outlier. It was the national standard, operating in complete ignorance of the data its own regulatory agency had already collected. Meanwhile, one of Perkins's patients had stopped eating breakfast, then lunch. Her name was Margaret Solano, 41 years old, a factory worker's wife who'd been prescribed Dexedrine 18 months earlier for depression and mild obesity. The weight loss had been the first visible sign that the drug was working. 12 pounds in 3 months, which her doctor noted approvingly, then 16 more pounds. Then a visit where Perkins noticed her hands had a faint tremor she hadn't had before, and her answers to his routine questions came slightly faster than normal, slightly more pressured, like a sentence being delivered with just a little too much air behind it. He reduced her dose. She did not fill the reduced prescription. She continued filling the original one at a second pharmacy 4 miles away. Perkins did not know about the second pharmacy. There was no system in 1959 that would have told him. Prescription monitoring programs, the databases that now alert physicians when a patient is filling controlled substance prescriptions at multiple locations, did not exist. Each pharmacy was its own island of information, connected to nothing. Margaret Solano was not doing anything that required particular ingenuity. She was simply going to a different address. The Senate noticed before the FDA moved. In 1962, Senator Estes Kefauver of Tennessee convened a subcommittee hearing on pharmaceutical industry practices, ostensibly focused on drug pricing, but expanding quickly into safety and marketing when the witnesses began arriving. Among them were physicians who had watched patients deteriorate on long-term amphetamine regimens. A psychiatrist from New York described patients presenting with symptoms indistinguishable from paranoid schizophrenia, visual hallucinations, persecutory delusions, disorganized speech, whose symptoms resolved completely within weeks of discontinuing amphetamine. He had documented 11 such cases in 3 years. He believed there were hundreds more that had been misdiagnosed and admitted to psychiatric facilities. The pharmaceutical industry's representatives testified after the physicians. Their position was that the cases described were outliers, statistically negligible, the result of misuse rather than therapeutic use, and that the overwhelming evidence supported the safety and efficacy of amphetamine in indicated conditions. Smith, Klein and French had, in preparation for the hearing, commissioned a study, internally funded, internally reviewed, that found no significant risk of dependency at prescribed doses. The study's methodology specified a follow-up period of 12 weeks. 12 weeks was not long enough to observe the dependency patterns the FDA's own classified report had documented. The subcommittee heard both sides, produced a report. The report recommended further study. Nothing changed immediately. The prescriptions kept climbing. Then, 1964 arrived with something that could not be framed as an outlier. A paper published in the British Journal of Psychiatry formally documented amphetamine psychosis as a distinct clinical syndrome. Not a pre-existing psychiatric condition unmasked by the drug, not a product of misuse, but a direct pharmacological consequence of sustained amphetamine exposure in patients with no prior psychiatric history. The authors had reviewed cases across multiple countries, multiple dosing regimens, and multiple amphetamine formulations. The pattern was consistent enough to constitute a syndrome. They named it. They described it in detail. They published it in one of the most widely read psychiatric journals in the English-speaking world. Smith, Klein, and French's Medical Affairs Department received a copy of the paper within weeks of publication. Their internal response, documented in corporate communications that would not become public until decades later, was to assign a team to identify methodological weaknesses in the study that could be highlighted in letters to the journal and in materials sent to prescribing physicians. The team found 3 points of critique. The letters were written, the materials were distributed, the paper's authors were not wrong. The corporate critique did not establish that they were wrong. It established only that the paper was not perfect, which no paper ever is, and that imperfection was used to create the appearance of scientific uncertainty, where the underlying finding was, in fact, solid. This technique was not invented by Smith, Klein, and French. It would, however, be refined and deployed by pharmaceutical companies for the next 60 years across multiple drug classes. The pattern here, in 1964, was one of the earliest recorded applications of what would later be identified as manufactured doubt, using the inherent limitations of individual studies to suggest that the totality of evidence was inconclusive, buying time in which sales continued uninterrupted. Dr. Perkins retired in 1967. His patient files were transferred to a colleague. Margaret Solano was not in those files under any flag or notation suggesting concern. She had attended her last appointment with Perkins in 1963, telling him she felt fine, presenting a weight that her new doctor would later describe as alarmingly low without having access to the baseline. She had been taking between 2 and 3 times her prescribed dose for 4 years. Her hands shook every morning until the first pill. She thought the shaking was just getting older. The Obertrol case broke in 1973, and it broke badly enough that even the regulatory machinery that had been moving at geological speed was forced to respond. Obertrol was a weight loss drug combining amphetamine salts with methamphetamine, a formulation that had been marketed aggressively through the 1950s and 1960s as a diet aid, sold to physicians with literature emphasizing its safety profile and its effectiveness in reducing appetite. By the early 1970s, emergency rooms across the country were seeing a specific patient presentation: middle-aged women, long-term Obertrol users, arriving in acute psychiatric crisis, paranoid ideation, severe cardiovascular stress. Bodies that had been running on stimulants for so long that removal of the drug produced collapse rather than relief. The FDA pulled Obertrol from the market in 1973. The manufacturer's name was Rexa Pharmacal. The compound was gone. The patent was not. In a filing cabinet somewhere in the pharmaceutical industry's legal architecture, the formulation, the specific combination of amphetamine salts, the ratio, the delivery mechanism, was sitting in documentation, waiting. Nobody had destroyed the recipe. Why would they? The compound itself had not been proven to lack efficacy. It had been pulled for safety concerns related to its marketing and oversight, not for a fundamental flaw in the chemistry. The recipe existed. The name had been erased. Daniel Reyes turned 14 in 2004, and the prescription that had been renewed every year since 1999 was renewed again. His dose had been increased once from 10 milligrams to 15 when his body weight crossed a threshold his pediatrician used as a dosing benchmark. The increase was unremarkable, standard. Carmen signed the consent form at the annual checkup without needing to read it twice. In October of that year, 3 weeks before his algebra midterm, Daniel took a second pill at 4 in the afternoon without telling anyone. The effect was not subtle. The material that had felt muddy and inaccessible sharpened into something he could move through quickly, methodically, with a confidence that felt like competence rather than chemistry. He studied for 6 hours without looking up. He scored a 94 on the exam. He put the bottle back in exactly the same position he had found it. The question that would take him 20 years to start asking was already present in that moment, fully formed, though he had no way yet to recognize it. If the regular dose made him functional, and the double dose made him exceptional, what did that mean about what he actually was without either one? He didn't ask it. He closed the bottle, went to bed, and got up the next morning and took the regular dose. Because it was morning, and that was what you did. Somewhere in a DEA field office in Washington, a file was accumulating. Not about Daniel Reyes, about a pattern. The pattern had a specific shape, a specific demographic signature, a specific geographic spread. It wasn't coming from the streets yet. It was coming from the pharmacies. Nobody had connected it publicly. Yet. The 1970 Controlled Substances Act was supposed to be the line. Congress drew it clearly. Amphetamines moved to Schedule II, the most restrictive category for drugs with accepted medical use, meaning no refills, no phone-in prescriptions, a paper trail for every transaction. The legal supply was deliberately constricted. The reasoning was sound. The outcome was not what anyone planned. When the legal supply shrinks and the demand doesn't, something else expands to fill the gap. It always does. The gap between what the pharmacies could now dispense and what the existing user population required was not small. It was the accumulated demand of 40 years of mass prescribing suddenly cut off at the knees. The black market didn't create that demand. It inherited it. But before the street market took over, the counterculture had already been running its own amphetamine story for a decade. The beat writers had gotten there first. Jack Kerouac typed the first draft of On the Road in April 1951 on a continuous scroll of paper taped together to avoid interrupting his pace. 120 feet long, fed through a typewriter over 3 weeks while he consumed benzodrine inhalers throughout. The scroll became legend. The method became a model. A generation of writers, artists, and musicians absorbed the implication that sustained creative intensity required chemical fuel and that the fuel was available, legal, and cheap. By the mid-1960s, the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco had a speed problem that was visible enough to generate its own internal counter-slogan. Not from law enforcement, not from the FDA, not from any public health institution, from within the drug culture itself. Speed Kills appeared on posters and flyers distributed by the Diggers, a loose collective of activists and artists operating in the Haight, who watched the neighborhood's amphetamine users deteriorating in ways that the LSD and marijuana users around them were not. Sunken faces, repetitive conversations that circled without landing. People who'd been awake for 5 days locked in apartments they wouldn't open. The counterculture issued a drug warning before the federal government did. That fact deserves a moment of stillness. The 1970 Act changed the legal architecture without changing the underlying chemistry of demand, and the group that moved fastest to supply what the law had restricted was not a cartel from another country. It was American, domestic, decentralized. Several Hells Angels chapters in Southern California had established small-scale methamphetamine manufacturing operations by the late 1960s, using ephedrine reduction chemistry that was neither secret nor technically complex for anyone with basic chemistry knowledge and access to the right precursor chemicals. By 1972, the DEA's field offices were documenting a manufacturing and distribution network that stretched from San Diego to Sacramento, operating out of rural properties, moving product through motorcycle club social structures that were genuinely difficult to penetrate. The meth being produced was not benzodrine. It was stronger, cheaper, and smokable, qualities that changed the pharmacology of the experience in ways that would matter enormously. Smoked methamphetamine reaches the brain in seconds rather than minutes, producing an intensity of initial effect that oral amphetamine cannot match, and that the brain's reward system registers at a fundamentally different level. The speed of delivery is a significant portion of the addictive mechanism. The faster the dopamine flood arrives, the more powerfully the brain codes the behavior as something to repeat. This was 1972. Crystal meth would not be a national crisis for another 20 years. The fuse had been lit. Lena Hartman was born in Jefferson City, Missouri in 1980, the second daughter of a mechanic and a school secretary. Her childhood was not remarkable in any way that would have predicted what came later. She was a good student, better at science than she let on in class, because being obviously good at things in her particular school carried social costs she had learned to avoid. She graduated in 1998, enrolled in a nursing program at a state college, and was working her first-floor rotation at a regional hospital by 2001. She was 21 years old, chronically behind on sleep, managing 12-hour shifts on a unit that was perpetually short-staffed, and having increasing difficulty organizing the administrative layer of her work, the documentation, the sequencing, the tracking of multiple patients simultaneously, in a way that satisfied her supervisors. Her supervising nurse suggested she talk to a doctor about focus and attention. The doctor administered a standard behavioral assessment. Lena answered the questions honestly. The difficulty sustaining attention on paperwork, the tendency to start multiple tasks and complete fewer of them, the sense that her brain was running slightly ahead of her ability to direct it. The assessment returned a score consistent with ADHD. The doctor prescribed Adderall at 10 milligrams twice daily. Lena filled the prescription on a Thursday. By the following Monday, she was filing her nursing documentation without errors for the first time in 3 months. Back in the timeline, the 1980s were doing something to rural America that would only be fully understood in retrospect. Crystal methamphetamine, not the pill form, not the injectable liquid, but the smokable crystal, emerged from the California distribution networks and moved east and south along routes that followed specific economic geographies. Counties where manufacturing had closed, towns where the largest employer had been a plant that was now a parking lot, communities where the structure that made daily life feel purposeful had been quietly removed over a decade of deindustrialization, leaving behind buildings, roads, people, and a particular quality of time that had nowhere to go. Meth filled that time. It filled it chemically, by eliminating fatigue and manufacturing purpose and energy out of nothing, and it filled it socially by creating an economy, small, illegal, destructive, but an economy, in places where the legal economy had departed. By the early 1990s, specific counties in Missouri, Iowa, and Oklahoma were reporting methamphetamine-related arrest increases of 300 to 400% over 5-year periods. These were not large cities. They were places where the county sheriff knew most of the names in the arrest reports personally. A sheriff in a rural Missouri county testified before a state legislature committee in 1994 that of the last 40 drug arrests his department had made, 31 involved methamphetamine. 3 years earlier, that number had been 4. Missouri established a meth lab seizure reporting system in 1995. In the first year, they logged 281 lab seizures. By 2004, that number was 2,867 in a single state, in a single year. Daniel Reyes turned 20 in 2010, a sophomore studying computer science at the University of Texas at Austin. His Adderall prescription had moved with him from pediatric to adult medicine without interruption. A brief transitional appointment with a new physician, a 5-minute conversation confirming he was still using the medication as prescribed, a new prescription pad replacing the old one. The continuity was seamless. This was, on paper, exactly how a well-managed long-term ADHD treatment course was supposed to work. What was not on paper was what had begun happening in the second semester of his freshman year. A classmate had run out of his own prescription a week before finals and had asked Daniel quietly, in the specific way that question gets asked in college dormitories, whether Daniel could spare a few. Daniel had given him 4 pills. The classmate had returned a month later. Then a different classmate had asked. Then a third person, someone Daniel barely knew, had appeared at his door with $30, folded into the specific casual configuration of someone who has done this before. Daniel had taken the money. He was not dealing. He told himself he was not dealing because he was not seeking buyers, not maintaining supply, not organizing anything. He was sharing. He was helping. The distinction felt real and important at the time, and it was, in a technical sense, partially true, and it did not change the fact that by the spring of his sophomore year he was running out of his own medication 5 days before the end of each month. He solved this the way people solve pharmaceutical shortfalls when they have a social network and a reputation for reliability. He found a second source. A friend in the engineering department had a prescription he found he didn't always need. The arrangement was informal, intermittent, and resolved Daniel's monthly gap without requiring him to see a doctor, explain himself, or acknowledge that the gap existed in the first place. He was 20 years old. He thought he was managing. The pharmaceutical market was running its own parallel story, operating at national scale simultaneously. In 1991, a drug called Ritalin, methylphenidate, a stimulant closely related to amphetamine in mechanism, though not in structure, had become the dominant treatment for childhood ADHD, following a diagnostic expansion that was itself the product of a specific sequence of events. In 1980, the American Psychiatric Association's diagnostic manual had formally defined attention deficit disorder as a discrete clinical category. In 1987, the definition was expanded and renamed ADHD, broadening the diagnostic criteria in ways that significantly increased the number of children who qualified. The ADHD diagnosis rate in American children had been approximately 1% in 1980. By 1990 it was climbing. By 2000 it was 7.5%. The number of children meeting the diagnostic criteria had not increased sevenfold in 20 years. The criteria had changed. The culture around diagnosis had changed. The pharmaceutical marketing directed at pediatricians had changed. What had also changed was the drug being used to treat the expanded diagnosis. By 1996, a new pharmaceutical company called Shire had entered the market with a stimulant formulation it was positioning as specifically designed for ADHD, more effective than Ritalin, better tolerated, longer acting. The drug was called Adderall. The name was new, the compound was not. Lena Hartman in Jefferson City was 4 months into her Adderall prescription when she noticed the 10 milligram dose wasn't doing what it had done in the first weeks. The sharpness she had felt on the first day, that quality of attention that felt like a door opening, had settled into something more ordinary, functional, but not the way it had been functional at the beginning. She mentioned this at her next appointment. Her doctor increased the dose to 15 milligrams. The door opened again. She did not know, sitting in that examination room in the winter of 2001, that the same thing had happened to Margaret Solano in Cincinnati in 1958. The mechanism was identical. The subjective experience was identical. 43 years separated them, and the prescribing conversation was nearly word for word the same. The dose increase worked, for a while. In rural Missouri, 40 miles from where Lena was filling her prescription, the County Meth Task Force was processing its 340th lab seizure of the year. The task force had been created 2 years earlier, specifically to address what the state's Attorney General had described as a public health emergency. The emergency had a specific face by 2001, not the biker gang face of the 1970s California origin story, but something that looked much more like the nursing stations and examination rooms and school pickup lines of ordinary American life. Meth had moved from the margins to the middle in the time it takes a child to grow up. The two stories, the prescription story and the street story, were running in parallel, in the same country, often in the same counties, drawing from the same population, causing different versions of the same damage through entirely different institutional channels. Nobody in authority was connecting them publicly. Lena's prescription was renewed in January 2002, and in March 2002, and in every month that followed. The dose increased once more to 20 milligrams in the summer of that year. By the fall, she had developed a habit, small and private, of taking her morning dose 15 minutes earlier than prescribed, because the transition from waking to the pill's effect had become, without her consciously registering it, something her body was trying to shorten. She was still a good nurse. Her documentation was still clean. Her supervisors still approved of her work. But something was coming that nobody could see from the outside. And it had been building in her brain and in the brains of millions of others since the first prescription was filled, since the first dose worked, since the first moment the pill made everything feel like it was finally operating at the level it was always supposed to reach. The question that should have been asked in 1959, when 4 FDA researchers filed their classified report and were told to say nothing, was about to demand an answer it could no longer be denied. The name Adderall was not invented by scientists. It was invented by a marketing department. In 1994, a small pharmaceutical company called Richwood Pharmaceutical in Florence, Kentucky, held the rights to a drug formulation that had been sitting in legal limbo for over a decade. The formulation was a mixture of amphetamine salts, 4 different forms of amphetamine combined in a specific ratio designed to produce a smoother, longer arc of effect than single salt formulations. Richwood had not developed this formulation from scratch. They had acquired it. The compound they acquired had a prior identity, a prior market history, and a prior reason for having been removed from that market. It was Obertrol. The same drug the FDA had forced off the market in 1973 after middle-aged women began arriving in emergency rooms in acute psychiatric and cardiovascular crisis. The same formulation, the same amphetamine salt combination, the same ratio. Richwood's legal team had determined that the 1973 withdrawal applied to Obertrol's specific approved indication, weight loss, and to the marketing practices that had surrounded it, not to the underlying compound. The chemistry had never been banned. The name had been retired. The molecule was available. Richwood resubmitted the compound to the FDA for a different indication, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. They rebranded it. The new name, Adderall, was a contraction of the phrase the marketing team had been using internally, ADD for all. The FDA approved it in 1996. The orange pill that Carmen Reyes' son began swallowing every morning in 1999 was at the molecular level Obertrol. This is not a contested fact. It is documented in the FDA's own approval paperwork, which lists the compound's prior marketing history as a weight loss drug and approves the reformulated version for pediatric ADHD. The documentation was public. It was never hidden. It simply required knowing what to look for, and in 1999, in a pediatrician's office in Austin, Texas, nobody was looking. The story could stop there, but it doesn't, because in 1995, a year before Adderall's approval, something else happened that has been far less discussed. The Drug Enforcement Administration sent a formal internal memorandum to the FDA. The memo was not classified. It was an interagency communication, the kind generated regularly in the normal functioning of federal regulatory machinery. Its subject was the rapid expansion of ADHD diagnoses in American children. Its central finding, stated in the flat declarative language of federal bureaucracy, was that the rate of ADHD diagnosis in children under 12 had increased at a pace statistically inconsistent with any known pattern of genuine disorder prevalence change. Genuine disorders do not increase sevenfold in 20 years. Populations do not spontaneously develop neurological conditions at rates that track pharmaceutical marketing cycles. The DEA memo said this essentially in the measured language of regulatory concern, and it recommended that the FDA consider the diagnostic expansion as a factor in evaluating future stimulant prescribing guidelines. The FDA received the memo, logged it, filed it. Adderall was approved the following year. Between 2000 and 2002, the pharmaceutical company Shire, which had acquired Richwood in 1997, and with it the Adderall patent, spent $5.7 million on lobbying activities directed at federal legislators and regulatory agencies. The lobbying agenda included opposition to any tightening of ADHD diagnostic criteria and support for policies that would facilitate stimulant prescribing through expanded coverage and reduced administrative burden on prescribing physicians. $5.7 million in 2 years from a company whose primary revenue source was a single drug, whose market depended entirely on the rate at which children and adults were diagnosed with a condition only treatable by that drug. The lobbying worked. Diagnostic criteria were not tightened. Prescribing continued expanding. Lena Hartman did not know any of this in 2003. She knew that her 20 mg morning dose was working, and that on the days she worked double shifts, which happened more often than her contract specified, because the unit was chronically short-staffed, she was taking an afternoon dose that was not prescribed. Not a separate prescription. Her prescription. The pills she was authorized to take in the morning. She was splitting the timing, taking one earlier, one later, telling herself this was a reasonable adaptation to an unusual work schedule, and not a restructuring of her pharmacology around increasing need. Her prescription was for 20 mg twice daily. She was taking 20 mg 3 times on double shift days. On those days she was going home at midnight, lying in the dark with her eyes open until 3 in the morning, getting up at 6 and taking her first pill before she reached the kitchen. She'd lost 11 pounds since starting the medication. Her supervisor had told her she looked tired. She had smiled and said she was fine because on the pill she felt fine. The gap between how she looked and how she felt had been growing for months without her registering it as data. The 1998 study that should have changed everything was called the MTA, the Multimodal Treatment Study of Children with ADHD. It was the largest, most expensive, most carefully controlled long-term study of ADHD medication ever conducted at that point, funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, involving 579 children across multiple sites, running for 14 months of active treatment, with follow-up assessments extending years beyond that. The initial results, published in 1999, were exactly what the pharmaceutical industry had hoped for. stimulant medication produced significant improvements in ADHD symptoms, outperforming behavioral therapy alone. The pharmaceutical industry cited those results extensively in marketing materials, in physician outreach, in responses to regulatory inquiries. The 1999 results became the scientific foundation upon which the continued expansion of pediatric stimulant prescribing rested. What the pharmaceutical industry did not cite were the follow-up results. At the 36-month assessment, the researchers found that the performance gap between the medicated group and the unmedicated group had largely disappeared. Children who had been on stimulant medication for 3 years showed no statistically significant advantage in academic achievement, social functioning, or behavioral outcomes compared to children who had received other forms of intervention or no treatment. The medication that had worked dramatically in the short term had, at the 3-year mark, stopped providing measurable long-term benefit beyond what development and maturation produced anyway. 2 of the study's lead researchers stated this finding publicly and directly. They presented it at conferences. They published it in peer-reviewed journals. One of them, in a 2007 interview, described the experience of watching the pharmaceutical industry's response as one of the most disorienting professional experiences of his career, not because the science was attacked with new data, but because it was surrounded by a fog of counter-studies, each funded by pharmaceutical interests, each finding slightly different results, each adding a layer of complexity to what he felt the MTA data had stated clearly. The fog was the point. The fog bought years. Daniel Reyes was 24 in 2014, working his first full-time job at a mid-sized software company in Austin. The prescription was still running, an adult psychiatrist now, rather than the pediatrician, but the same monthly appointment, the same paper, the same orange bottle. At work he was fast, reliable, precise in a way that his colleagues noticed and occasionally mentioned. He had become, professionally, exactly the person the medication had been designed to help him become. He did not think about this. It didn't occur to him to think about it, the way it does not occur to a person to think about the mechanics of walking while they are walking. What he thought about, on the specific afternoon in late November 2014, when his prescription ran 3 days short, was that the last 3 days of each month had begun to have a quality he could not accurately name, not sickness, not pain, a kind of interior dimming, a slowing, a sense that the world had not changed but his access to it had reduced in some way that he could not compensate for through effort or sleep or caffeine. He was functional, he went to work, he completed his assignments. But the work cost more than it did on other days, and the cost was not visible from the outside, and that invisibility was its own particular weight. He told himself this was what ADHD felt like without medication. He had been told this, in various forms, by various physicians since he was 9. The explanation was available, ready, and had the significant advantage of being at least partially true. What it did not account for was the other part, the part that was not ADHD returning, but was the brain's own dopamine production, suppressed by years of external chemical flooding, operating at a baseline that was no longer its own original baseline, but was instead the flaw of a dependency that nobody had measured or named. There was no way for Daniel to know this from inside his own experience. There was no scan, no test, no appointment that would have distinguished one explanation from the other. His psychiatrist, asked about the end-of-month pattern, noted it in the file and said it suggested his current dose might need a small adjustment. The dose was adjusted upward. In Jefferson City, Lena Hartman had begun writing prescriptions that were not for her patients. Not many. Not at first. The first one was for herself. A refill, written 3 days before her legitimate refill date was due, using a prescription pad from a supply closet on her floor. She'd done it quickly, with the clinical efficiency of someone who writes prescriptions all day and had filled it at a pharmacy 20 miles from her home. She had felt doing it less like a criminal than like a person solving a logistics problem. The problem being that she needed the medication to function at a level her job required, and the authorized supply was no longer keeping pace with the need. That was 2004. She was 24 years old. She did not forge another prescription for 7 months. Then it was twice in 1 month. Then the intervals shortened in ways that followed a curve she could have plotted if she'd been looking at it from the outside, as clearly as any pharmacological tolerance graph in any medical textbook she'd studied. The question that hung over everything, over Daniel's dose adjustment, over Lena's prescription pad, over the MTA study's buried follow-up data, over the DEA memo that the FDA had filed and not acted on, was not whether something had gone wrong. It was who had known, and when, and what they had decided to do with what they knew. The answer was not a conspiracy. It was worse than a conspiracy, in the specific way that institutional decisions made by many people across many years for many different individual reasons can produce outcomes that no single person intended, and that no single person can be held responsible for. It was a system working exactly as it had been designed to work. The design was the problem, and the system was about to produce numbers that would make denial structurally impossible. The number that broke the record was 16.4 million. That was the total annual stimulant prescriptions dispensed in the United States in 2012, a figure that represented a 750% increase from the 1990 baseline of approximately 1.9 million. The increase had not been linear. It had been a curve that bent sharply upward around 1996, the year Adderall entered the market, and again around 2003, when Adderall XR, an extended-release formulation that lasted 12 hours instead of 6, was approved and immediately became Shire's highest revenue product. Each new formulation had triggered a new marketing cycle directed at physicians. Each cycle had expanded the diagnosed population, and each expansion had moved the prescription total to a number that, the year before it arrived, would have seemed implausible. The 2012 figure did not trigger an emergency declaration. It triggered a Johns Hopkins study. The study, published in 2016, focused specifically on college campuses, the same campuses where students had been dissolving Benzedrine inhaler strips in coffee in 1934, the same population Gordon Alice had never thought about when he filed his 1927 patent. The researchers surveyed students across multiple institutions with methodological safeguards designed to produce honest answers rather than socially acceptable ones. Their central finding: 1 in 5 college students had used prescription ADHD stimulants without a prescription in the past year. Not lifetime, past year. 20% of the enrolled college population of the United States was using Schedule II controlled substances outside of any medical supervision, and the primary source for those substances was not the street market, not a dealer, not the black market networks that the DEA had been monitoring for decades. The primary source was other students with legitimate prescriptions. What the Johns Hopkins study had captured, in its methodologically careful way, was the endpoint of a supply chain that ran directly from the pediatrician's office through the college dormitory to the undiagnosed student down the hall. The legitimate prescription system had become the distribution infrastructure for a parallel non-prescription market operating inside every major university in the country. The two systems were not separate. They were the same system, branching at the point of the orange bottle. Daniel Reyes had been one branch of that system for 4 years in college. He was 32 in 2022, still medicated, still functional by every external measure. His code shipped on time. His performance reviews were strong. He kept his apartment in a specific order that he had learned, over years, was necessary, not preference, necessity. because the window between the morning pill and the moment it reached full effect was a period of about 40 minutes, during which the state of his environment either assisted or catastrophically disrupted his ability to begin working. He had structured his entire life around a 40-minute pharmaceutical window. He had done this so gradually, so naturally, that it did not feel like accommodation. It felt like personality. The pandemic arrived in March 2020 and changed the stimulant crisis in a way no policy had managed to accomplish in either direction. The DEA, responding to the public health emergency, temporarily loosened restrictions on controlled substance prescribing via telehealth, meaning that for the first time in the history of Schedule II regulation, a patient could receive an Adderall prescription following a video call rather than an in-person examination. The practical threshold dropped from a physical visit, a face-to-face behavioral assessment, and a prescription written by hand on secure paper to a 15-minute video call and a digital prescription. Telehealth platforms moved into the gap immediately. Companies like Cerebral and Dun, digital mental health startups backed by venture capital, operating on subscription models, employing contracted prescribers working from home, began advertising directly to consumers on social media platforms. The advertisements were targeted with algorithmic precision at users who had engaged with ADHD content, mental health content, or productivity content. The message was consistent across platforms. You might have undiagnosed ADHD. Getting diagnosed is easier than you think, and treatment is available quickly. The diagnosis to prescription pathway on some platforms had been reduced to a 2-question online screening followed by a 15-minute video call. Not an hour-long behavioral assessment administered by a trained psychologist. 2 questions. Stimulant prescriptions increased 30% between 2020 and 2022. In 2 years. After 3 decades of already accelerating growth, the curve bent upward again, more sharply than any previous inflection point. The system that had been running at capacity broke. August 2021, the FDA formally declared a nationwide shortage of amphetamine mixed salts, Adderall, its generics, every formulation. The official cause cited in the declaration was a manufacturing delay at one major supplier. This was true, and it was also insufficient as complete explanation, because a system with adequate redundancy absorbs single manufacturer delays without nationwide impact. The shortage spread because the entire supply infrastructure had been calibrated to meet demand so precisely that any disruption at any point propagated immediately to every pharmacy in the country. The margin had been 0. Nobody had noticed until there was nothing left. 3 million patients discovered their medication was unavailable. The experience divided roughly along lines of severity and duration of use. Recent patients, people who had been diagnosed and medicated within the previous 2 or 3 years, experienced disruption, frustration, difficulty. Patients who had been continuously medicated for a decade or more experienced something the clinical literature describes as discontinuation syndrome, but which, in practice, looked different in each person and worse in most than the clinical term suggests. Daniel Reyes was one of the 3 million. He had been continuously medicated for 22 years at that point, from age 9 to age 31, with no gaps longer than 3 days. And the shortage arrived without warning on a Tuesday in October, when his pharmacy's automated system sent him a text message at 7:43 in the morning. He was already at his desk. The pill should have been in his system for 90 minutes by then, but he had run 1 day short due to a weekend dosing irregularity, and he had planned to pick up the refill that afternoon. He read the text 3 times. Then he put the phone face down on the desk and tried to begin working. By noon, he had written 4 lines of code and deleted 3 of them. By 3 in the afternoon, he had called 6 pharmacies, been told the same thing by all six, and was sitting on his couch with the specific quality of stillness that comes not from calm but from the absence of the chemical signal his brain used to initiate movement. It was not withdrawal in the way opioid withdrawal is withdrawal. There were no physical convulsions, no acute physiological crisis. It was quieter than that, and in its quietness it was harder to name and therefore harder to address. The world had not changed. His apartment looked the same. The work was still there, the same tasks, the same deadlines. What had changed was something interior and structural. The scaffolding that had been holding the work up had been removed, and without it the work did not fall dramatically. It simply sat there, inert, inaccessible. At a distance he could see but not close. He sat on the couch for 2 hours. Then he ordered food he didn't eat, watched television he didn't follow, and went to bed at 8:30 because there was nothing else his brain would agree to do. He lay there thinking about a question that had been available to him for 22 years, but that he had never previously needed to ask with any urgency. Who was he without the pill? Not rhetorically, practically, functionally. What was the actual Daniel Reyes, operating on his own neurochemistry, capable of? He did not know. He had not known since he was 9 years old, and the not knowing had never mattered before because the pill had always been there. In Jefferson City, Lena Hartman's story reached its institutional endpoint in the spring of 2019. A pharmacist at a Walgreens 40 miles from her hospital noticed a pattern in a prescription that arrived on a Thursday afternoon. The prescriber's DEA number didn't match the format issued in Missouri, a detail so small it required attention and a specific kind of professional suspicion to catch. The pharmacist called the hospital. The hospital's pharmacy director pulled Lena's prescribing records. The investigation that followed took 11 days and produced a documented list of 23 fraudulently written prescriptions over a period of 4 years, totaling 1,840 tablets. Lena was placed on administrative leave on a Monday morning. Her nursing license was suspended the following Friday. She surrendered voluntarily to law enforcement the week after that, accompanied by a lawyer who had negotiated a plea arrangement that substituted mandatory treatment for the first offence incarceration the charge would otherwise have carried. She entered a residential treatment program in Kansas City in June 2019. She was 38 years old. She had been a nurse for 17 years. The intake assessment at the treatment centre asked her to list all substances she had used. She wrote one word: Adderall. The intake counsellor noted in the clinical file that this was the most common single substance presentation he had seen in the past 3 years, and that the majority of those cases had arrived through the same pathway: legitimate prescription, gradual dose escalation, supply shortfall, prescription fraud. The pathway had a shape. The shape was a funnel. The treatment program Lena entered was an 18-month residential course, not 30 days, 18 months, because the clinical evidence on stimulant dependency recovery had established by 2019 that short-term detoxification produced relapse rates above 85% within the first year. The brain's own dopamine production, suppressed by years of external chemical supplementation, required extended time to recalibrate. Months of cognitive flatness, emotional blunting, an inability to feel pleasure or motivation at normal levels. This was the price of recalibration, and it was high enough that most people in early recovery, given easy access to the thing that would end the flatness immediately, took it. Lena did not have easy access. That was the structure of the program. Simultaneously in Washington, the DEA was running calculations that would have been politically impossible to discuss publicly. The production quota system, the annual determination of how many grams of each Schedule II substance could legally be manufactured, had been tracking the prescription increase for 2 decades adjusting upward each year to meet demand. The 2020 quota for amphetamine mixed salts was 34.2 metric tons. 34 metric tons of amphetamine, authorized, manufactured and distributed within the legal pharmaceutical system in a single year. For context, the DEA's own estimates of the entire illicit methamphetamine supply entering the United States annually, from cartels, from domestic production, from every illegal source combined, was approximately 77 metric tons at its 2019 peak. The legal amphetamine supply was nearly half the size of the entire illicit meth market, in a single country, in a single year. The comparison was not published in any government report. It appeared in a 2021 academic paper on stimulant supply economics that received no mainstream media coverage. Daniel Reyes found his medication after 11 days. A pharmacy 2 counties over had received a partial shipment, enough to fill existing prescriptions for patients with documented long-term use. He drove 40 minutes each way, picked up the bottle, took the first pill in his car in the parking lot before the drive back. By the time he reached the highway, the scaffolding was back up. He merged into traffic and felt, with a clarity that the 11 days had made newly visible, exactly how much of what he called himself had been built on a foundation he had never chosen and could not easily remove. The question he'd been sitting with for 11 days did not go away when the medication returned. It waited. The 11 days had planted something in Daniel Reyes that the returning prescription could not remove. He took the medication. He went back to work. The code shipped on time, the performance reviews remained strong, the apartment stayed in its required order. From the outside, nothing had changed. Inside, the 11 days sat in his memory like a reference point he kept returning to without meaning to, not with longing, not with horror, but with the specific quality of attention a person gives to something that has told them a truth they haven't finished understanding yet. In March 2023, he made an appointment with a psychiatrist he had not seen before. Not his prescribing physician, a different doctor at a different practice, someone with no prior relationship to his medication history. He brought a printed summary of his prescription record, 25 years documented, and asked a question he had been constructing for 18 months. He wanted to know what his brain actually looked like now, after this long, and whether the dependency the 11 days had revealed was a permanent condition or a temporary one. The psychiatrist's answer was careful and honest in equal measure. The research on long-term structural brain changes from childhood-initiated stimulant use was real. Multiple neuroimaging studies had documented measurable differences in the dopaminergic systems of adults who'd been continuously medicated since childhood compared to both unmedicated ADHD adults and neurotypical controls. The differences were not catastrophic. They were not nothing. The prefrontal cortex, the region most involved in the attention and impulse control that ADHD medication targets, showed patterns in long-term users that researchers described with phrases like altered development trajectory, language that meant something had grown differently than it would have grown without the intervention, and that the direction and significance of that difference was still being studied in 2023 for a drug that had been prescribed to children since 1996. The psychiatrist said that discontinuation was possible. She said it required a structured taper over several months, not an abrupt stop. She said the outcome was genuinely uncertain. Some long-term users tapered successfully and found a functional baseline they could live with, while others experienced a protracted recovery period that lasted 1 to 2 years, during which cognitive performance and emotional regulation operated below what the medicated baseline had been. She said there was no reliable predictor at the individual level of which category a given patient would fall into. She said the decision was his. Daniel scheduled a follow-up appointment and drove home in a car that suddenly felt quieter than it had on the way there. In Washington, the regulatory response to the 2021 shortage and the telehealth prescribing explosion was arriving 2 years late, as regulatory responses typically do. In February 2023, the DEA proposed new rules that would require in-person evaluations before stimulant prescriptions could be issued via telehealth, reversing the emergency pandemic, loosening that had been in place since 2020 and that the data showed had directly contributed to the prescription surge. The proposal was specific, evidence-based, and supported by the documented prescribing data from the telehealth platforms. The pharmaceutical industry's response was immediate. Within 3 months of the proposed rules publication, the DEA had received over 38,000 public comments, the largest comment volume in the agency's history for a proposed rule change. The comments opposing the restriction were not identical, but they followed templates in ways that suggested organizational coordination. Shire's successor company, now operating under the name Takeda following a series of acquisitions, spent $3.1 million on lobbying in 2023 alone. Telehealth platform companies spent an additional combined $4.7 million. The argument they made was consistent and not without legitimate elements. Patients in rural areas, patients with transportation barriers, patients who had been appropriately diagnosed and responsibly medicated, faced real hardship if in-person requirements were reimposed. The rule was not finalized in its proposed form. The in-person requirement was modified, softened, extended with transition periods. The net result was that the telehealth prescribing pathway remained substantially open. The prescription numbers, which had briefly plateaued during the shortage, began climbing again in 2023. The global picture in 2024 was a different scale of the same story. Southeast Asia had been running its own methamphetamine crisis for a decade that made the American rural meth epidemic of the 1990s look, in comparative terms, restrained. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime estimated that approximately 200 million people in East and Southeast Asia used methamphetamine-type stimulants annually, a figure so large it constituted roughly a third of the global population of amphetamine users. Myanmar's Shan state had become the world's largest methamphetamine production zone, with estimated annual output exceeding 1,000 metric tons. The production infrastructure was controlled by armed groups operating in ungoverned border territories, using precursor chemicals sourced from legitimate industrial suppliers across multiple countries, moving product through distribution networks that spanned a dozen nations. The DEA's 34 metric ton legal production quota suddenly had context. In Europe, a different version was unfolding. ADHD diagnosis rates in the United Kingdom had increased 400% between 2000 and 2023, tracking a decade behind the American pattern with the same shape. Slow early growth, sharp acceleration, a supply system straining to meet demand. The NHS was reporting average wait times of over 2 years for adult ADHD assessments through public healthcare channels. The private clinic sector, unburdened by NHS waiting lists, had expanded rapidly to fill the gap, with online assessment platforms operating on business models structurally identical to the American telehealth companies that the DEA had just attempted and largely failed to restrict. The pattern was not American. The pattern was a feature of the molecule meeting a particular configuration of modern life: the attention economy, the performance demands, the diagnostic frameworks, and producing the same outcome wherever those conditions existed. On TikTok, in 2022 and 2023, the hashtag #ADHD accumulated over 8 billion views. The content was predominantly first-person, people describing their experience of undiagnosed ADHD, listing symptoms, performing recognition, generating the specific social reward of being understood by strangers who nodded along in comments. The content was not uniformly inaccurate. Many people describing genuine experiences of attention difficulty found through the platform a language and a framework for something they had been managing without a name for years. But the platform's algorithm optimized for engagement, not diagnostic accuracy. The symptom lists that generated the most views were the broadest. Descriptions of distraction, procrastination, emotional dysregulation, difficulty with boring tasks that overlap substantially with the normal human experience of living in a high-stimulation digital environment. A 2023 study found that individuals who had self-identified with ADHD through social media content before seeking formal diagnosis received a confirmed clinical diagnosis at a significantly lower rate than individuals who presented through traditional referral pathways. The self-diagnosis wave was measurably increasing the diagnosed population. The diagnosed population was measurably increasing prescriptions. The prescriptions were measurably increasing demand. And the demand, as 2021 had demonstrated, had already exceeded the system's capacity to supply. The circle had no exit built into it. Lena Hartman completed her 18-month residential treatment program in December 2020 during the first winter of the pandemic in a facility where the common rooms had been reconfigured to maintain distance and the group sessions had moved to outdoor spaces despite the cold. She left with a recovery plan, a revoked nursing license, and a brain that she described to her case manager as feeling like a television operating on a signal that kept briefly dropping out, functional for stretches, then briefly blank, then functional again, the blank shortening slowly over months in a way that required faith in a process she could not directly observe. She applied for license reinstatement in Missouri in 2022. The application required documentation of treatment completion, a period of supervised practice, character references, and a formal hearing before the state nursing board. The hearing lasted 3 hours. The board questioned her about her prescribing conduct, her treatment course, her current functioning, and her plan for managing the conditions that had contributed to the fraud. She answered without deflection or self-exculpation. The treatment program had, among other things, taught her the specific uselessness of both. The board reinstated her license with conditions: mandatory drug testing, supervised practice for 2 years, no prescribing authority. She accepted and began working at the treatment center where she'd recovered, not as a nurse initially, but as a peer support specialist, a role that required her to sit across from people at the beginning of the process she had completed and describe what the other end of it had looked like. She was good at this in a way that her supervisor documented as unusual, not because she was warm, though she was, because she was precise. She described the recovery process with the clinical specificity of a nurse and the interior knowledge of a patient, and the combination produced a quality of credibility that newly admitted patients responded to differently than they responded to therapists who had only one of those two things. By 2024, she'd been sober for 5 years. Her nursing license had been fully reinstated in January of that year. The supervisory conditions lifted after the 2-year period concluded without incident. She was 44 years old. She still had days, not many but real, when the dopamine flatness that the treatment literature had predicted arrived without warning and settled over a few hours like weather, making ordinary tasks feel inaccessible in a way that had a specific, familiar quality she had learned to wait out rather than fix. She had learned to wait. That was the whole skill. It had taken 18 months to acquire. Daniel Reyes began his taper in May 2024. His psychiatrist designed a reduction schedule spanning 4 months, small decrements, long plateaus, careful monitoring. The first reduction, from his standard dose to a slightly lower one, produced no noticeable effect for 2 weeks, and then produced what he could only describe as a ceiling that had previously been invisible. The work that had felt fluid became work he had to push against. The 40-minute morning window became a longer, less defined period of uncertainty about when, or whether, a functional state would arrive. He kept working. He shipped code that was slower to produce an equivalent in quality. He started keeping a notebook, handwritten, something he had not done since childhood, because the act of writing by hand was slower than typing, and the slowness turned out to be something his unmedicated brain could use, a pace it could match rather than chase. By August, he was at half his original dose. By November, he was off it entirely. The world did not end. That was the first thing he noticed. The second thing he noticed was that the world was considerably harder to navigate than it had been, and that the difficulty had a texture, uneven, sometimes manageable, occasionally impenetrable. That he was only beginning to learn to read. He was 34 years old, and learning something about his own brain that he had not been allowed to learn at 9, or 14, or 22, or any of the years in between. Whether what he was experiencing was his ADHD returning, or his brain recalibrating, or both simultaneously, or something the diagnostic categories didn't cleanly describe. His psychiatrist, asked directly, said she did not yet know. The research that would answer that question with precision was still being conducted. The studies were ongoing. The data would be published in journals that most people who needed the answer would never read. He bought a second notebook in December. The first one was full. The question he had asked on the couch during the 11-day shortage, who was he without the pill, had an answer now that was less satisfying and more real than any answer he could have constructed before he had the data. He was someone who worked more slowly and completed fewer tasks per day, and occasionally sat for 20 minutes unable to begin something that previously would have taken him 30 seconds to engage with. He was also, for the first time in his adult life, someone whose experience of a given hour was generated entirely by his own neurochemistry, for better and for worse, with nothing borrowed and nothing owed. Whether that was better, whether the trade was worth it, was a question the science could not answer for him. He was still sitting with it. In 2023, American pharmacies dispensed 41 million Adderall prescriptions. That number looks different now. It is not an abstraction about supply chains or regulatory failure or pharmaceutical industry incentive structures, though it is all of those things simultaneously. It is 41 million individual moments. A pharmacist handing a bottle across a counter, a name on a label, a person who needed something and found it, or thought they found it, or found something close enough to what they needed that the distinction stopped mattering before they had the language to make it. It is Carmen Reyes signing a consent form at a pediatrician's office in 1999 because her son's teacher had finally given her a framework for something she'd been watching without understanding for 3 years. It is Lena Hartman filling a prescription on a Thursday and being a better nurse the following Monday by every measurable standard available to her profession. It is also Margaret Solano going to a second pharmacy 4 miles from the first one in 1959, so that a man who genuinely wanted to help her would not find out that his help was no longer sufficient. The 41 million exists on a line that begins in Bucharest in 1887, runs through a Los Angeles laboratory in 1927, accelerates through the chemistry of a blitzkrieg and the marketing of a diet pill, and the rebranding of a withdrawn compound, and the loosening of a telehealth regulation, and arrives at a pharmacy counter that looks nothing like any of those origin points, and is made entirely of them. Daniel Reyes was on day 11 without Adderall when he first understood this, not intellectually, not as a fact he had read, but as something he felt in the specific quality of the silence in his apartment at 2 PM, when the work sat in front of him and would not move. He was not a cautionary tale. He was not a data point. He was a person who had been given a solution at 9 years old before either he or the people who loved him had been allowed to fully understand the problem, and who had lived inside that solution for so long that the solution and the self had become genuinely difficult to separate. He sat at his desk in January 2025, 8 months off medication, and worked. Not quickly. Not with the fluid, unbroken momentum that the orange bottle had produced for 25 years. He wrote a function, stopped, looked at it for 4 minutes, revised it, stopped again. The cursor blinked in the silence. His hands, resting on the keyboard, were entirely still. Lena Hartman walked into a treatment center intake room on the same Tuesday morning and sat across from a man who had just arrived the night before, 31 years old, a teacher whose Adderall prescription had been written by a telehealth platform following a screening that had taken 8 minutes. She had a folder with his intake assessment. She set it aside. She did not open it. She looked at him the way a person looks at someone when they are about to tell them something true about a road they have not yet walked but will need to, and she began. She had been doing this for 3 years. She was still learning how. The DEA published its annual production quota adjustment in the spring of 2025. The authorized manufacturing volume for amphetamine mixed salts, the compound at the center of everything this story is described, the molecule Lazar Edeleanu synthesized in a Bucharest laboratory 138 years earlier while studying something else entirely, was set at its highest level in history, higher than 2022, higher than 2020, higher than any previous year in the documented record of American pharmaceutical regulation. The quota had been requested by the manufacturers. The request was supported by prescription data. The prescription data showed continuing demand growth. The demand growth was real. All of it was real. The demand, the data, the request, the approval. Every step in the chain was documented, authorized, and consistent with the rules of the system as designed. The system produced the number it was designed to produce. Somewhere in the regulatory record of the United States federal government, there is a 4-page internal memorandum filed by a DEA analyst in 1995, a 40-page classified report filed by 4 FDA researchers in 1959, and the original patent application filed by Gordon Alice in 1927, all describing the same molecule from 3 different institutional distances, all noting in the particular language of their respective eras that something about this compound required careful attention. The 1927 patent was filed to protect commercial interest. The 1959 report was filed and suppressed. The 1995 memo was filed and ignored. The compound was approved, prescribed, reformulated, rebranded, expanded, and is now being manufactured at the highest authorized volume in its history. The careful attention was paid. Something else was paid more carefully. Lazar Edeleanu finished his notes in 1887, cleaned his equipment, and moved on to the next compound in his systematic investigation. He had no clinical intent, no commercial interest, no awareness of what the human nervous system would do when the molecule he had just documented entered it. He was a chemist doing chemistry. The synthesis was complete. The notation was filed. The paper was published in a German journal that circulated among a few hundred specialists. He had no idea what he had made. The people who came after him, Allers in his Los Angeles laboratory, the executives at Smith, Klein and French reviewing inhaler sales figures, the military planners counting Pervitin tablets, the marketing teams who named Adderall after the population they intended to capture, the telehealth platforms that reduced diagnosis to 8 minutes and a credit card. They knew. Not all of it. Not all at once. and not always with the full weight of consequence visible from where they stood. But they knew enough. The data existed. The warnings existed. The classified reports and the buried studies and the unanswered memos existed in filing cabinets and regulatory archives, waiting to be found by people who would find them too late to change what had already been built on top of them. In 2026, the United States is in the middle of what researchers at 3 independent institutions have separately described, in published papers, as an ADHD diagnosis crisis. Not a crisis of too many people suffering from the condition, but a crisis of a diagnostic and treatment system operating so far beyond its evidential foundations that the original scientific rationale has become difficult to locate beneath the accumulated weight of commercial, cultural, and institutional interests that have grown around it over 90 years. 41 million prescriptions. That was 2023. The 2025 data has not been fully tabulated yet. Preliminary figures suggest the number is higher. Daniel Reyes opened his second notebook on a Thursday morning in February 2025. The first page already had 3 lines on it from the previous week, a function he had been thinking about, written out in the slow, deliberate handwriting of someone relearning what it felt like to think without acceleration. He read the 3 lines. He picked up the pen. He added a 4th. Outside, Austin was already loud with morning traffic, the particular density of a city that had tripled in size in 20 years and showed no sign of stopping. He did not look up. The pen moved slowly across the page, and the slowness was not a problem he was trying to fix. It was just where he was. The production quota went up again in March. The story isn't over.